Welcome to another episode of Readings in Theological German. I apologize for the long hiatus that we took, but we're back, so let's get back to this article that we have been working on. We will be starting a brand new section of this article today. It's called The Semantic Functions of the Constructus Verbindung, which is a term that you will not probably find in your dictionary for that abbreviation, but you should just know from the previous part of the article that is what is being abbreviated here, and just from context and everything else, it's talking about a construct chain, which is what we see here in Hebrew, Memleket Kohanim, and that's what we're discussing, and we're discussing in particular a construct chain, which is a Hebrew phenomenon, in Exodus 19:6a. So this whole section is going to talk about how construct chains work, the semantic functions of them that they can take, and what the implications of that would be for this particular construct chain in this particular context. All right, so the first thing just to note here is that we're going to get several kind of partial or incomplete sentences sort of in this section, which is good because we've kind of been doing, full sentences up to this point on this channel. And so now we're going to get into a little section here where there's kind of bullet points and different things going on that will make for German that is, less articulate, less explicitly construed. You'll have to sort of, fill out the discourse a bit. Just the same way you would in English with a similar kind of section, which is we do write this way on occasion when bullet points are sufficient for what we're trying to communicate. So here you actually kind of have the first little point. It just says the first member / Nomen Regens. So that's just equating those two things. And this, of course, is actually, I sort of pronounce it like it was German, but it's actually Latin, and I have no idea how to pronounce Latin. Why is it Latin? Well, it has something to do with the history of scholasticism in Europe, I'm sure, but the point is this is an old kind of archaic way of talking about a particular grammatical category with this particular kind of construction, which exists in various languages such as Hebrew. Hebrew is one language, but it's not the only language that has this type of thing, where you get two nouns in a construct relationship or a construct chain, and the way you differentiate what each noun is doing is you talk about one being the head or ruling noun, which is what the Regens here is, and nomen, of course, being noun. And in this particular case, the head noun is Mamleket, and so you have Mamleket there. Then you have the second part, which it says here, second member, nomen rectum, the noun that is being ruled by that head noun, and in this case it is Kohanim, or priests, so kingdom of priests. So these are just the grammatical categories, and this is just laying that out ahead of time, so there's no real sentences here, but you just have, let's just get it on the table. You basically got two parts to this construct, the head noun Mamleket, and or Mamlaka, I should say, and the ruled noun Kohanim, and those are going to be put into a construction together. Now, when that construction is formed, this is what's now being discussed. The two members of the construction can, now this here is, of course, the verb können, and können, being an auxiliary verb, takes a infinitive complement, which you will find at the end of the clause. So you go down to the end of the clause, you find your infinitive complement. Here it is werden. Well, that opens up a kind of some additional possibilities, because werden could form a future construction, or it could form a passive construction. And if it's future, you would need an infinitive complement. If it's passive, you're going to have a participial complement. And so you want to normally look for that at the very end of the clause with auxiliary verbs, but werden is already at the end of the clause because of the earlier auxiliary verb, and so then you just back up one position and you find this verb here, aufgefasst. And aufgefasst is, of course, a participle, so we know we're dealing with a passive construction. But how do we know it's a participle? Well, aufgefasst has a ge in the middle, which is a dead giveaway that this is a participle. But then you also want to pay attention to why that ge is supposed to be a prefix, and yet it's in the middle of the word, and that is because this is one of these famous and irritating separable verbs in German, where you have auf as the prefix and fassen as the actual verb. And auf kind of changes its meaning in some sense. And with separable verbs, usually the auf comes after somewhere. If this verb was in the kind of conjugated position, auf would be at the end of the clause, and you would have fassen somewhere up in the middle of the clause. However, in this case, because the whole thing got moved to the end of the clause, then the verb fassen had to actually go behind the auf, and that's why you end up with this as your lexical form. But the main point is, make sure when you're looking up these verbs, you're looking up the separable verb, auffassen, and you can see here that it's going to mean something like to interpret or to understand, which is not necessarily the same thing as what you would find if you looked up fassen, which normally just means something like to take hold of or to grasp, which auffassen can also mean that in certain contexts, but in this context it certainly means to interpret or to understand. Okay, so with all that being said, how do we finish translating our sentence? So we have this modal construct, okay, so the two members of the construction can be, now we're going to go passive here, be interpreted as subjective genitive. Oh, isn't that nice? We got some English in here. You know, just so you're aware, this little phrase here, subjective genitive, in this German article does translate to subjective genitive in English. Isn't it nice? Why don't they just write the whole thing in English? That would make life a lot easier. It's interesting to think about why is this English here at all, actually? It just shows you, I guess, the weight of English scholarship on recent biblical scholarship, because you know, the Germans here are using Latin to get at the kind of the older thing that we used to talk about in terms of structures in language. But then they don't seem to have a German word for the category they want to discuss, and so they talk about subjective genitives. Anyways, it can be interpreted as a subjective genitive, as an adverbial genitive, or as an adjectival genitive. Okay, so a pretty straightforward sentence there, but kind of cool to have, you know, back-to-back auxiliaries and figure out all the verbs and stuff. Okay, so then we have within these categories, further differences arise. Now, I just want to point out here, you have a reflexive verb. Okay, so when you look up ergeben in your dictionary, be sure to check the entry for the reflexive meaning, not the transitive meaning. So it's reflexive. It's also, in this case, just to kind of note the word order, the sentence begins with the prepositional phrase which modifies the whole thing. And so once you've done that, your verb still has to come in second position, as always in German, which means your subject is down at the end. And so that's why I kind of jumped past the verb for a second, because in English, you still got to put the subject in front of the verb, even if you begin the sentence with the prepositional phrase, which you can do in English, but you don't have to, obviously, just like you don't have to in German. So I did so in English. I started with that prepositional phrase, so then I jumped down, pick up the subject, further differences, and then I put the verb in, arise. You could also actually start with the subject and say further differences arise within these categories. So different ways to translate it, but just be mindful of your word order in German. Okay, so you can kind of see what's going on with the structure now of this section. I think it's just important to highlight, because sometimes when you're reading this type of stuff in German where you don't have full sentences, where things aren't spelled out completely, you want to sort of see how it's all sort of fitting together in the discourse, so that these kind of partial bullet point things will kind of make sense. They need a wider context, because they are so abbreviated, as you can see. So let's just quickly tease that out for a second. So you know you're going to be looking at three semantic categories, right? Subjective, adverbial, and adjectival genitives. And you know further that there are going to be further differences within those categories. So when you get down here and you see group 1, subjective genitive, and group 2, adverbial genitive, and you're expecting, oh yes, the next page is going to have group 3, adjectival genitives. And why are these groups? Oh, well, because there's further differences within these categories. And so then you see some bullet points here. You go, oh yeah, genitive of agency, genitive of quality. Again, they're using English terminology here for the grammar. And you say, okay, these must be the further differences that are within each category. So right away, that tells you that you're going to be looking at this thing here and this thing here as things that are different from each other, but within the category of a subjective genitive. So you're kind of building a whole context, and you do this naturally when you're reading, I think, in your first language. But I think it's helpful to just kind of look at that and map it out before we start trying to translate any of these other little fragments, because it will just help us to keep them all within their right context, and so they'll just make more sense to us. But I will leave all of that to the next installment. So I hope you found this helpful episode, and I'll see you next time. As always, thank you for watching, and please do like and subscribe and share with all your friends, and hopefully we'll get to the next one within a week or so that we're not having such big gaps in between them. But of course, many of you, in fact, the vast majority of people who will ever watch these videos, if you're even still watching at this point, the vast majority of people who will ever watch these videos are going to be watching them long after they've been recorded and uploaded, and so likely the whole series is already finished and you're off to the races. You probably got 10 more episodes to look at right now, but I haven't made them yet. But this is the beauty of digital media. It becomes kind of timeless in the end. All right. Have a good week.